And a big welcome back to the Endurance Hour podcast. I'm your host, Dave Erickson. Roger Thompson is off this week. He'll be back next week for episode 120. This is episode 119, and we are on a roll. This is a huge podcast for you today. You may want to take some notes or listen to this over and over again because there is so much endurance gold that you'll want to just take up stake and say, I'm staying here for a while, because we're going to be talking about what VO2 is, how to find your VO2 max, lactate threshold, the science behind that, heart rate training, the pros and cons, high intensity interval training, as well as Tabata training. My goodness, I just got done speaking for about 50 minutes with Dr. Matt Silvers. He's an assistant professor at Whitworth University in North Spokane, Washington, in the Department of Health Sciences. And this guy knows his stuff. Talk about number crunching, data, research, studies, personal as well as professional. Dr. Silvers did a VO2 max test on me a few years ago. Found it very helpful, very informational. And this guy's also a multiple Ironman finisher, marathon runner, and as you'll hear at the very end of our interview, a late bloomer in the world of wrestling. It'll make sense here a little while, but I'm very excited to share this episode with you. For those of you listening for the very first time, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher Smart Radio, and online at endurancehour.com. We're also on Facebook, of course, and we're approaching 2,000 fans on Facebook. I feel like we're the podcast, the little podcast that could. Not many people know about us, but the people that do are loyal fans and listeners, and we appreciate your support. We are, again, at episode 119. We started this 2.5 years ago. We've been all around the country doing podcasts on location. Roger and I have been going strong at this and will continue to go strong. In fact, both of us will be at the Ironman World Championship in Kona here in October. Roger, as you know, has qualified for the race for the second year in a row. In fact, he was 15th overall in Canada. I know, Roger, you're listening right now, so you want me to stop bragging about you? I will. But we'll probably have some special reports for you on location in Kona here coming up on, let me look at my calendar. We both arrive on October 7th, just in time for the Parade of Nations, which Roger will take part in. And then we have the race week activities, and we'll have some special interviews with athletes on site. And because of my role with Ironman as an Ironman reporter, I will have access to professional athletes, the pro press conference, pre and post. I'll be providing video coverage for Ironman exclusively on Ironman.com. So be sure to look for that. It'll be my 6th year in a row providing coverage for them. It's a very big honor, and I'm glad to be back this year and to be back there with Roger for the 36th annual Ironman World Championship. If you have any questions for us, or you have some topic suggestions, or maybe a guest you'd like to have on the program, send us an email to endurancehour@gmail.com. Let us know, and we'll follow up with that. And please keep on leaving us comments on our Facebook page. We read those, as well as any ratings you can do and comments on iTunes. A majority of our listeners are on iTunes, although we do have other platforms, namely Stitcher Smart Radio and EnduranceHour.com. We listen to them, we read them, we hear them, we discuss them, and we're very appreciative of you as a follower, both age groupers and professionals alike. And it wasn't that long ago we started taking a multimedia approach to our podcast by providing not only an audio version, but also a video version. And you can see that on YouTube. The YouTube username is SBR Vids. Stands for Swim, Bike, Run, Video, so SBR Vids. So you can see this entire podcast in video form on YouTube, as well as some of our most recent video podcasts as well, and we'll continue to do so moving forward. So without further ado, here's my one-on-one interview with Dr. Matt Silvers from Whitworth University. So I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Matt Silvers, assistant professor at Whitworth University in the Department of Health Sciences, and we are in the Human Performance Lab.
That's correct.
Literally in the Human Performance Lab.
In the Human Performance Lab.
What goes on in here?
A variety of things. We primarily use this as a teaching and a research facility. So we have a variety of courses here at Whitworth University that would use this space for the application of concepts that they'll use in class. As an example, I teach our exercise physiology course. And so every single week, we're going through concepts that we talk about in lecture in here, whether that be showing them, how to perform a VO2 max test, lactate threshold test, looking at various aspects of muscle activation, the whole kit and caboodle. We try to simulate human performance here, and then use some of our fancy equipment to measure those responses.
As an assistant professor, what is your role at the university?
Yeah, so primarily here at Whitworth, my role is a teacher, and so I'm responsible for several courses. Exercise Phys is the one I just mentioned. Another one is Evidence-Based Health Science, which is more or less a research methods course, and so we use this space very intensively in the spring for that purpose. Students develop original research projects, many of them human performance oriented, and that's kind of fun to be around. But in addition to that, conducting research of my own, advising students, service to the discipline, those are all kind of part of the package.
You're a numbers guy?
I am.
You numbers, and you love research. You love digging your nose into a book and going over data?
I do, yeah. I'm kind of wired for planning, and so especially for me with my background, I've got a training background, and I really like making programs. So coaching on the side is something that's pretty interesting to me as well.
What programs do you lean toward? Is it strictly running? Because I know you do, personally, I know you are involved in running programs.
Yeah, I think that there's some ebb and flow. You know, there was a time in my life where I leaned more towards the strength and conditioning side. In fact, I'd say a lot of my training was probably more on the strength and conditioning side. So anything with resistance training programs or strength and conditioning, which would really be kind of an overarching umbrella with the resistance and the agility and the actual aerobic or anaerobic conditioning. But lately, I think I've focused more towards running, cycling, triathlon types of coaching.
That's perfect. We're here on the Endurance Hour.
That's right.
What an odd thing that we're here in the Performance Lab talking about this. For those that don't know exactly or want to get into more details of it, go over what is VO2, or is it? Yeah, it's VO2, not VO2 max. There's a within the VO2 range. What is VO2?
Yeah, so VO2 just stands for oxygen consumption. So within mammals, so us and other types of critters, we're able to breathe oxygen in from the air and then use that oxygen to create energy. The amount of oxygen that we're using at any given minute to create energy is what we would define as VO2. And so all the way up to someone's maximum ability to consume oxygen, you can have small VO2s up to your VO2 max. Now, the more oxygen you can consume to produce energy, the more endurance potential you have.
And the types of testing that you could do here to determine that are what?
Yeah, we use a technique called indirect calorimetry, and so most people are familiar with calling it a metabolic cart. And so essentially we would hook up a mask to an individual where we can capture all of their expired air, and then the gas analyzer looks at how much oxygen is in that expired air. There should be less than the air that you inspired, so the machine's able to back calculate and say, okay, this is how much oxygen this individual consumed. So that's the technology we would use to measure VO2. The test protocols can vary greatly depending on what an individual desires. So for instance, we can run them on a bike, we can run them on a rower, we can run them on a treadmill. Very common protocol would be a ramp type thing where we'd start at low to moderate intensity, and every minute or two we ramp up the intensity all the way up to exhaustion when a person decides they want to be finished.
And the point of that is it doesn't matter the type of testing per se, because the equation always works out the same of determining how much oxygen is left.
Yeah, it does matter a little bit in the sense that, for instance, the term that you'll hear thrown out all the time is VO2 max, and it's supposed to represent what's someone's maximum ability to consume oxygen and produce energy. Well, based on how efficient an individual is with a certain mode of exercise, let's say bicycling or running, they may not be able to reach their maximum VO2 during that test versus maybe a different mode. So the literature, the research literature has really shifted away from VO2 max, and they say VO2 peak now to try and imply this is the highest VO2 they hit during that test. But perhaps maybe on a different day, different mode, maybe they'd actually get a little bit higher than that. So with that being said, very typical for a lot of people would be to have a lower VO2 max on a bike than they would on a treadmill. Unless they spend a lot of time on the bike, then you may not see much different at all between a bike and a run.
Is that because the overall necessary energy it takes to get to that level on a treadmill, because you're using the full body versus
Yeah, I think it's easier for people to just engage more muscle mass, which would then
Mhm.
equate to a higher VO2 max on a treadmill than they are on a bike. Unless, again, they're accustomed to being on the bike, they know how to push it a little bit harder than most people.
At the Timex Multisport Camp 2 years ago, I think the entire team was given the opportunity to do this,
Hmm.
but we did it with blood testing.
Hmm.
Is this the same type? That's lactate, isn't it?
Lactate.
Okay, let's move on to
Yeah.
lactate.
Yeah.
And is blood the best way to do that? A similar process. We're on a treadmill. I remember the incline was increased over so many periods of minutes, and then you give an exertion level, like how hard did it feel, and then we're testing your blood.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm actually giving a presentation in a clinic on that this weekend. So there's a variety of things, and the lactate threshold arena has really expanded in recent years. So I would say traditionally it has been thought that blood lactate testing, so actually getting a blood sample, was the best way to do it. But with a variety of other protocols that have kind of arisen over the last number of years, when I say protocols, different types of things that anyone could do without being in a lab necessarily, having access to blood lactate testing. I don't necessarily know if it would be fair to say that's the best anymore. Certainly, if you want to see where blood lactate's at and what's going on, yeah, you're going to have to measure the blood. But what are the implications of those results? I think that's what's changing kind of the sphere of lactate threshold testing. In particular, very traditional thought, when the term lactate threshold was coined, it was basically supposed to imply how hard could someone exercise for an hour. So if someone was to go out for a run, what's the fastest they could run for an hour? And then as they started looking at blood lactate concentrations for an effort like that, they noticed that blood lactate would rise as intensity increased, and it seemed like around a concentration of 4 millimolars per deciliter of blood, you'd get this really big upward spike, a big deflection. And so they said, okay, it's when we're around 4, and or when we get this big deflection, that's lactate threshold, meaning that if someone's exercising over that point, they're not going to be able to maintain that for very long. And so you get this whole wave of testing that's built around that. It says, okay, when you hit 4, that means you're there. And then you've got to have some training recommendations from those results. So a lot of the research, well, let me say this differently, a lot of the coaching strategies you have seen have been train at lactate threshold if you want to improve lactate threshold. Well, now we're starting to see that maybe there's some different testing protocols that are more accurate. For instance, if you were to do a really standard ramped protocol, kind of like you described, just keep increasing the intensity, stage by stage until you get that upward deflection. Well, sometimes it's difficult, depending on the protocol, to say, was it this stage of exercise that elicited the big spike, and could they maintain that for a really long time? Or is it the cumulative exhaustion of the tests that we're seeing here? And so a newer term that you'll see in the research for blood lactate testing is MLSS. It's an acronym for maximal lactate steady state. And basically, if you were to take someone, do a very standard blood lactate test, ramp them up till you get the upward deflection, that kind of narrows your wattage range, so you can figure out, say on a bike, what workload should we try to target for an MLSS test, or it might be the speed on the treadmill that you're shooting for. And then you basically just have someone run or ride at those intensities for an extended period of time, and you continuously monitor the blood lactate to see, is it really staying at lactate threshold, or is it going up or down? And I think that really allows an athlete to fine-tune, is this the right intensity for me to be training at? Now, with that being said, there's a recent review that came out in the literature that really called into question this training recommendation for lactate threshold. If someone wants to improve lactate threshold, the preponderance, I think, of coaching has said, train at lactate threshold. But really, when you look at the literature, I wouldn't say there's a preponderance of evidence that says that is the way to do it. In fact, there's a lot of articles that have shown lactate threshold to be improved with kind of base work, the really low intensity, sustained types of riding and running people do in the off season. Certainly, training at lactate threshold has been shown to be effective. And more recently, kind of the big trend in our area is the high intensity interval training. And they've found some pretty impressive increases in lactate threshold with that. So I guess the name of the game is there's a lot of ways you can improve lactate threshold, and now there's more ways of testing lactate threshold, whether it's with blood or out there on the road.
So in the past, people have gone up to that 4 number, and the tester said, okay, you can keep on going if you want to, but we're not going to get any better results out of this, so you've hit your spot. Whereas now they're saying, maybe we'll let the person go a little bit longer and see if there is any variation in lactate.
Yeah, I'd say, well, at least with the testing I'm familiar with, oftentimes I think you get up to that 4 mark and you still wanted to let them go further to make sure that you saw that upward deflection as well. Because sometimes it might happen at a higher value like 5. I think the newer trend is basically to find wherever that upward deflection is, or whatever number you're targeting, 4 or 5, and say, okay, we're going to stick you right here and see if you stay there, regardless of what that number is. And I think that's where it's kind of going right now.
And some of the testing that you were talking about, is this for higher end athletes, or is this something everyone should at least get a baseline for?
Yeah, great question.
Is it necessary?
Yeah, I don't think that lab testing is necessary for everyone unless they're at a point where perhaps they've been training for a while and they want to make a big step up. I think that's a point where you might want to start to take things a little bit more seriously. But a lot of the practical tests that people can use that don't require a lab or fancy equipment, I think those are very applicable to anyone. With that being said, the information, where do I think my lactate threshold is, I think it's applicable to everyone if that's the goal of their training, right? If their goal is just to have fun, then don't bog yourself down with numbers. Maybe lactate threshold is fun for them, so you've been around a lot of athletes. It just depends on what their disposition is.
I don't want to assume everyone knows what lactate is and what happens physically in the body. So my basic knowledge is that if you get enough lactate build up in your muscles, you're just going to shut down. Can you kind of break it into simpler terms? What is lactate for people who don't even know what we're talking about why you even care about a threshold?
Sure. Well, we have 3 energy systems, just metabolic systems in our body that would produce energy. And that energy, from a biological standpoint, is called ATP. So when you split ATP apart, that releases energy. And most of that is lost as heat, which is the calories. When someone says they're burning calories, that's essentially what we're measuring, is that heat loss. But we're able to harness some of that energy for mechanical work, and that would be running or riding or whatever. So you've got these 3 energy systems that can make ATP. 2 of them are anaerobic, meaning that you can create energy without having to use oxygen, and one of them is aerobic, and you obviously need to use oxygen for that. The max rate of that oxidative system or energy system is what we call VO2 max or VO2 peak. Okay? So that means that we have to start looking at these other curves. What's their role? They can produce energy much, much faster, but they're confined by certain limitations. One of them, for instance, if you were just sprinting for 100 meters, you're only going to have enough fuel to supply that energy system for maybe 10 to 15 seconds. And then that's when you have to shut down, walk, replenish that system, and you can replenish it really quickly. But that's, those kinds of intervals aren't really beneficial for an endurance athlete, right? A 10 to 15 second thing, that might be helpful for a workout, but not necessarily for any performance they're going to do. So then we look at the next energy system, which is called the glycolytic system. Sometimes it's known as the lactic acid system. And that's where you use carbohydrates. You break those down through a process, and you're going to end up with this fancy little molecule called pyruvate. Pyruvate then can go one of 2 places. It can either get shuttled into the mitochondria of a cell. That's where all the oxygen processing happens, or it can get turned into lactate. Now, there's bottlenecks on these mitochondria, and they can only accept pyruvate at a certain rate. So if you're exercising at an intensity that's high enough that the mitochondria can't accept all that pyruvate, then the pyruvate is just going to be hanging out, and at that point in time, it gets turned into lactate. So at this point, it's probably important to say or dispel a few myths that have been out for a long time, and for good reason. It used to be that people thought lactate was the problem. Lactate was this precursor for fatigue and all that, because they'd see people fatigue in the lab and they'd see, wow, lactate concentrations in the blood are really, really high. This must be the problem. Now we actually know that lactate is a friend, not a foe. It's actually really, really helpful. It's just a marker for the fatigue. What the problem is when you convert pyruvate to lactate, you go through this transition phase where it becomes lactic acid. So it's pyruvate to lactic acid to lactate. That conversion from lactic acid to lactate releases protons into a cell, a muscle fiber, and those are very acidic. And every aspect of our body is designed to work within a certain pH tolerance. So when you start putting a bunch of acidic things in a muscle cell, it starts to shut down all of the systems that are designed to work within a certain pH. If you go below that, they just don't want to work. So to try and keep things on the up and up, the muscle cell will export the lactate and the protons into the blood. And at that point, the muscle cell can still function, but now you've just kind of robbed Peter to pay Paul. You've taken this acidic substance and put it into the bloodstream. And so that's going to have some consequences in terms of how you breathe. And of course, that's how we're able to measure the blood lactate, is we just look at what the lactate concentrations are. And there's an implication then, okay, that means the blood is also really acidic, and it also means some active muscles are creating a lot of this lactate and they're pumping it out to the system. Lactate threshold then basically just implies what is the point, like the max point that a muscle will reach where lactate production equals lactate export. So as soon as you're creating this lactate and the associated protons that are going to cause all these problems, what's the point where you can't get rid of them as fast as they're being produced? And when you start to go beyond that point, that's when you start to get an acidic environment building up in the cells, and that's what's shutting you down, even though the lactate is just kind of hanging out and not necessarily causing a problem.
And this is only the result of a certain effort during your workout or a race.
Correct. Yeah, I liken it to lighting a metabolic time bomb. So on your way up to VO2 max, everyone's going to have, they're going to surpass their lactate threshold. For an untrained individual, that's often around 50 to 60% of their VO2 max intensity.
Because they're untrained.
Yes.
They haven't built up.
Correct. Correct. And then as someone starts to train, it's very common to see a lactate threshold be 70 to 80% of VO2 max. And then when you start getting into the elite level athletes, endurance athletes, it's not uncommon to see 90% higher, 90% or higher.
Okay.
So it's very trainable, despite what someone's VO2 max is. They're related but separate training concepts.
So someone out there who's training, hey, I've been on a bike ride for the last 3-4 hours, but I've been going 15 miles per hour, got a tailwind, I'm just kind of cruising along. Lactate acid will not be your problem, most likely.
Probably not. Yeah,
Probably not.
If they're feeling like it's easy, that's probably not going to be an issue.
Okay.
Now, one time when a speed may become an issue is, let's say that particular individual is just cruising along, it's easy at 15 miles an hour, but that individual has not done long rides to build up a specific type of muscular endurance. At some point, the muscle fibers are going to start fatiguing. You'll recruit more and more fibers. And as you start to recruit more fibers due to fatigue, that's when the relative intensity starts to increase. 15 miles an hour starts to become really, really hard, even though it was easy for perhaps an extended period of time on the front end.
Two-parter here. Let's say someone has built up this process where they're not able to get rid of the balance on a bike ride, in a race. So they've got to that point. What are they going to feel? What are the signs and symptoms they're going to recognize? I've been to that point. Yeah,
great. So a really great practical test someone can use to assess if they're at lactate threshold is what I call the talk test. If someone is just cruising along on a bike or a run and they're chatty Cathy and they can talk with a running partner, hey, it's great, blah, blah, then they're definitely under lactate threshold.
Okay.
If they can't talk at all, they're breathing so hard they can't talk, they are over lactate threshold. But when you get to this spot where you're breathing hard enough that you could talk, but you'd prefer to probably give like 1 to 2 syllable answers, that's right around it. And the reason for that is, as I mentioned, is those protons get exported into the blood with the lactate. They're acidic, and that drives our respiratory system to breathe harder so that we can balance the acidity of the blood.
Pump the blood through and like circulate it out?
Well, when I breathe in, I breathe in, oxygen and nitrogen and carbon dioxide from the air around us,
Mm-hmm.
but there's just minimal carbon dioxide. As a part of all these processes I've talked about, our body will create carbon dioxide. So when I breathe out, there's quite a bit more carbon dioxide going out into the atmosphere. That carbon dioxide has to get from the muscles where it's produced into the environment. So at some point, it's going to get into the blood, and then it's going to go up to the lungs, and then it has to dissolve in the lungs, and then we breathe that out. Carbon dioxide is acidic, and so we've got systems set up where when pH drops too low, there's just an internal drive to start breathing harder to get rid of that acidic stimulus. Well, protons essentially end up doing the same thing. When you create the lactate, they're making your blood more acidic, so it kind of kicks this respiratory drive into overdrive, so you breathe harder to try and keep that blood pH balanced, if that makes sense. So that's why the talk test is pretty good, because when someone starts breathing harder, they're not going to want to talk very much. But you also know that lactate threshold is kind of this intensity that some people might describe as uncomfortably comfortable. So you could talk, you would just prefer not to.
Okay. Is there also a relationship between muscle cramps, or is that a different topic altogether?
Totally different topic.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then part two of this is, let's say you've experienced this lactate threshold during your bike ride, and now you're getting ready for the run. Or in a triathlon. Can you get it back? Can you get back to balance, and how long will it take?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a trainability piece there. It's amazing how much...
Because you said ticking time bomb earlier.
Yeah. So I'd say, to carry that metaphor all the way to fruition, if you're training over or competing over lactate threshold, you've lit this metabolic time bomb, which means that lactate's going to gradually build up. And again, it's not the lactate, it's the protons that are with it. They're building up inside a muscle, and they're going to start causing things to shut down. How high above lactate threshold you are is going to dictate how soon you're going to break down. So the goal, of course, is with racing experience, you know exactly what intensity you can race at, so that when you come through the finish line, that's when the bomb goes off. You don't want that to go off, and you've got 10 miles left in a run, nor do you want to finish the race and say, I had a lot left in me. Now, again, if the goal is just to finish the race with a smile, then that could be okay. But if the goal was maximum performance, you want to dial in the intensities for everything such that the metabolic time bomb is ticking, and it's going to go off right when you hit the finish line. So let's say it does go off before the finish line. You've built up a bunch of lactate. Is there a way to get it out of the system and kind of restore things to balance? Yes, but oftentimes it means you're going to have to reduce intensity perhaps below what a goal pace was.
Yeah.
And so maybe that means starting out the run really easily until you feel comfortable, and then you can start ramping that back up. But it can take quite a while to get that back down, depending on how long you were operating above lactate threshold and what the kind of cumulative damage of that was. Now, there's a trainability piece there too in terms of mental toughness. Athletes who are really accustomed to that feeling of fatigue oftentimes have a better ability to push through that to some degree than someone who's not. Because they're like, I've been here before, I know what I can do in this situation, where someone else might say, this doesn't feel comfortable, I don't know if I can maintain this for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, or whatever. It's pretty impressive how much psychological mediation will affect our physiological responses. So to train in a type of situation where you're operating above lactate threshold, and then you're still trying to train even if you were maybe 2 above that threshold, I think that experience can be really helpful in a race. But yeah, for someone that maybe hasn't had that experience, typically that means you're going to have to slow down. And then they may get it back. It just depends on how much time they have and what damage was done heading into it. So,
for those out there who have great mental toughness or willpower to fight through it, what's the potential damage that can be done? Can there be some damage if you push through this and you have all this extra lactate acid in your bloodstream? What is the potential damage of, I'm just tough, I'm going to fight through this,
Yeah.
I'm going to go, I know I have 5 more miles to run, but I'm going to suffer?
Yeah, currently, at least with our knowledge, if we were looking at it from just a pure blood lactate standpoint, or I should say lactate buildup within the muscles, It just means there's probably going to require a longer recovery following that race performance, which is sometimes difficult for a lot of type A athletes, which, triathlon attracts a lot of those, running attracts a lot of those, cycling attracts a lot of those. So maybe you need to finish the race and take, a good 1 or 2 weeks off, just focus on active recovery. I mean, it really depends on the duration of the race. If we're talking Ironman, then 1 to 2 weeks would be very applicable. If we're talking a sprint triathlon, really, really hard push, it may not require as long to recover. But in terms of like skeletal muscle damage and those kinds of things, there's probably not going to be some sort of long-standing damage as a result of lactate buildup. Sometimes, though, when you're operating at that kind of a red line, there are other things going on that could be, I don't want to say more permanent damage, but I mean, obviously, if someone was like injured, they had a strained Achilles tendon or something, and they ran really hard on it. I mean, that could obviously elicit a lot of damage. So,
one thing you mentioned earlier about recognizing that you're at lactate in a race. What are the factors? And I know those factors are determined in the training or in the testing. What are those factors that let you know that you are there? For example, heart rate or pace or speed. We didn't touch on that yet.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do would be to do some sort of lactate threshold test, whether that be maybe the talk test without a lab. Maybe you go all in and you do a blood lactate test in a lab, and you're collecting data on some of the other parameters. So maybe it's wattage on a bike, speed on a treadmill, heart rate, how do I feel, like an RPE, those kinds of things, so that when okay, I'm at lactate threshold, what was my heart rate at that? What was my wattage at that? And at that point in time, now you've got something that might be a little bit more objective to guide the training intensity.
So you need that information, that data, before you can go out there and say, like an everyday athlete, weekend warrior, boy, I think I'm running at lactate threshold right now, or I'm at my max. Well, how do you know that? I feel like it. Yeah, but do you have any data to support that? What are you looking at to tell you that? And that's where this testing comes into play. Like, based on my numbers, it was this number here, this speed here.
Yeah, and I think repetitive testing in some form can be really helpful for validation, because I'll see a lot of athletes in here that want to do a VO2 max or lactate threshold test, and that we collect as much data as we possibly can in those situations. And they'll come in and they'll do almost identical performances on lactate threshold, but maybe heart rate will be different because they were more hydrated one time versus another, or perhaps they were more recovered one day than another day. And so having kind of a slew of data that you can say, okay, what is normal for me at lactate threshold versus this one time I was in a lab and it was this. Well, what if that one time was maybe not right? Because it's very, very possible. So
I know something I use as an athlete. I know Roger uses this as well. We upload our data to Training Peaks. And so it uploads from our devices, whether it's our bike computer or a watch, and then we can compare over races. Like, where was I in wattage? Where was I in heart rate? Where did the drop happen? And then you can look at it from maybe an early season race to a late season race to see maybe improvements or how you can use that data to improve. So would you suggest, as a performance lab instructor here, preseason testing and then mid-season or post-season? Where would you do your two testing? Because you need to have a comparison.
Right? I think it really comes down to the perspective that the athlete has. Without a doubt, I feel like two tests are really, really helpful. Something, at least initially, maybe that's before a season or mid-season, that can then give you some boundaries to guide training. Okay, this is where we think lactate threshold is or VO2 max, so that you could train at this intensity. And then a second test to see, okay, how's your training worked? Is it improved? Now, some people choose to maybe do the initial test before season, do the post test maybe mid-season, because they don't want to bother with that during racing. Some people might do the pre-test mid-season and do the post-test right before a big race. And that might serve two purposes. One, for a confidence boost. Wow, this is where I'm at. And two, maybe to help guide what that race intensity should be.
Maybe people, let's talk about heart rate training, or training with heart rate versus, I don't look at, gosh, I was talking to someone recently. I only train at heart rate. Oh, it was on a bike. I said, do you have a power meter? They said, no, this is an elite athlete. don't have a power meter. You don't? I felt silly asking, and
Yeah.
like made him embarrassed. You don't have a power meter?
Yeah.
How do you determine where you are and how you're able to maintain a certain effort on your bike during a half Ironman, for example? He goes, I go on heart rate. Pros and cons.
Yeah, before power meters, heart rate was super popular, and it's still a really helpful metric. And I'll just throw this out as a prompt to remind me. Heart rate recovery is a big element that continues to keep heart rate at the forefront of training technology. So moving away from that, one problem we have with heart rate training, particularly with endurance athletics, like triathlons and cycling events, is that there's this concept called CV drift. And as you exercise for an extended period of time, you're going to sweat. That water is coming from somewhere. Typically, that's going to be coming from blood plasma. So your overall blood volume is going to drop. If you're in really hot conditions, that's going to happen even faster. So what you'll see is that over an extended period of time, hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, longer, you're going to see at the exact same speed, heart rate start to drift up. Now, let's say, for instance, you're using heart rate to guide your training. You say, okay, I want to be within X zone.
Yeah.
Well, as your heart rate starts to experience this CV drift thing, you start slowing down to keep your heart rate. Now, all of a sudden, you started at 20 miles an hour, and you're backed off to 19, and then you backed off to 18, whatever. Now, that could still be helpful from a physiological standpoint. You could still getting a good training effect, but power meters and GPS watches allow people to more objectively, I guess, prescribe the exercise workload. So the perspective shifts to, I want to maintain X number of watts for 3 hours. I don't care what's happening to my heart rate, because now my body has been subjected to this very consistent training load versus one that I'm modulating. Does that make sense?
A little bit.
Yeah. So anyway, heart rate training could still be very, very effective. Very, very effective. But in extended situations, and especially when you've got hot, humid types of conditions, heart rate is not going to be stable for a long period of time. It's going to experience a CV drift. Now, if someone knows when that drift's going to occur, how much, they could still use just heart rate and probably gauge a bike pace or a run pace accurately, because I've been here before. I know that at mile 13, my heart rate's 5 beats per minute when I started. I mean, they could do that, but if they expect it to be stable the entire time for something that like a half marathon, a marathon, half iron, anything like that, yeah, they're crazy. It's not going to happen.
And the factors I know that help determine heart rate, whether it's going to be a CV drift or not, is hydration, nutrition, fitness level.
Yeah, and sleep, stress, recovery from previous workouts. Those things have a pretty dramatic effect on heart rate.
One technique that Roger knows about that I did at Ironman Arizona last year, and it was purely a heart rate technique, was walking the aid stations, watching my heart rate, and then watching it drop to a certain number, and then go back to running again. And the next one drop, and then I was able to have a lower heart rate overall average because I didn't let it peak. So I was running, and I came down to a transition or a water station, let it drop to, let's say, 150. And then I got back to running, and then I went up to 168, 170. Okay, I'm going to stay there. Now I'm going to drop down again, and it helped recovery. It was a recovery technique.
Sure.
And is that something you would prescribe? Because you also have, I hope I don't bulldoze you here, this 5 in 1 theory for running a marathon or half marathon.
Yeah, I'd say you can do the walk run in whatever intervals you want, whether it be 5-1 or if you're an Ironman, you're walking every aid station, which is every mile. Whatever an individual wants. I think that's going to help out with an overall perception of fatigue, and certainly will allow for some recovery during the event, regardless of what those intervals are. I think that's really, really helpful. It kind of comes down to what's the performance someone's wanting to elicit.
Yeah.
Does it work for them? Does it not work for them? The heart rate piece, while that could tie in with that, almost speaks to something a little bit different in the sense that how quickly your heart rate will come down following some sort of exercise bout will help speak to how fit you are. So, there's a variety of VO2 max estimation style tests that physical educators will use and stuff, like the step test, and They basically want people to take their pulse following the exercise about, and they want to see over an extended period of time what's going on, how fast is that coming back down towards resting, and that we're going to have this calculation that estimates then your aerobic fitness based on that. So you could use heart rate in that context of saying, I know that when my heart rate comes down to a certain level during the walking, that's when it's time for me to go.
Okay.
Versus I'm just going to walk for 30 seconds, or I'm just going to walk for the length of the aid station or whatever it is. So it could be a helpful metric to look at if that's what you wanted to guide the intervals and the rests.
You talked about this a while ago. You mentioned high intensity interval training. The benefits of that, short term and long term, because I've heard a lot of great things. They have this whole HITS series you'll find online in places, and they have these, whether it's a 6 or 12-minute workout that involves going hard for 90 seconds, take a 30-second break, or something along those lines. What do you know about the, again, pros and cons of HITS training?
Yeah. So I'd say HIT started becoming popular back in '96 with Tabata. Izumi Tabata was the Japanese scientist that was training, I believe, the speed skating team, and they were wildly successful with that. So the Tabata intervals that he used was 20 seconds at 175% VO2 max. I mean, really high intensity effort, followed by 10 seconds of rest, and then you repeated that. So it was a 4-minute bout of work. And a study that was published in '96 compared the effects of that to something very traditional, is like 70% VO2 max effort, kind of a moderate intensity type of exercise bout for an extended period of time, 30 minutes or 20 minutes, something like that. And they found that the endurance improvements, aerobic capacity, were very similar between those two. One was 4 minutes long, one was 20 minutes long, but the endurance improvements were very similar, and anaerobic power, so kind of like your sprinting ability, was also improved with the Tabata. So that kind of started this craze. And at this point, people take Tabata and they apply that classical 20-10 work-rest ratio to a lot of different modes of exercise. Maybe it's cycling, swimming, running, CrossFit stuff, kettlebell, whatever. So I have followed the interval stuff pretty closely in the last number of years because we do some of that research here. In fact, I'm doing a study this academic year that's comparing different modes with high-intensity cycling to something more traditional with running to see what would the carryover be to run performance. What we do know is that high-intensity interval training in any mode can be really effective at improving your fitness, both VO2 max and lactate threshold. We do know that. We know that it can improve those things very, very quickly. And more recent research has started to take the HIT types of protocols, slightly modified, and using them with diseased populations, cardiac rehab populations, anyone that we'd consider a special population that in the past people were like, well, we need to be really careful. I mean, it wasn't actually that long ago when physicians did not recommend people do exercise following some sort of cardiac surgery because they thought the stress on the heart would not be helpful. But then we soon realized, and evidence is research is always a little bit behind the ball on this, that actually is the most beneficial thing you could be doing. So HIIT is kind of the next evolution even for those populations. And the neat thing about that is those populations tend to be long-term sedentary populations where maybe they've never been active for 40, 50 years. They've got a lot of different things going on, both metabolically, cardiovascularly, whatever. And HIIT training is also effective for them. Perhaps maybe as effective or more effective than traditional lower intensity training. So in a lot of different populations, the literature is starting to back the fact that HIIT is effective and you can see improvements within 2 weeks. What we don't necessarily know right now is it more effective? Is it less effective? And how long can you do a HIIT program before perhaps you've adapted to it and you're not going to realize further benefits? For instance, we've read a lot about this summer. We didn't see really any differences in programs that had that were 2 weeks long versus say 4, 6, 8 weeks long. It seemed like in many of them, they would get this benefit really quick, and then they kind of stabilize. And so I guess a practical note on that is it was something that's really high intensity. I mean, something more akin to Tabata stuff, short, uber intense or intervals. Probably going to get a really fast and big benefit from that, but you may not continue to get these benefits. I mean, there's going to be some top point for everyone.
Sure.
Now, with that being said, high intensity intervals might be subject to definition. Tabata and the really uber intense short work stuff is what kind of framed HIIT, but now it's shifted more towards longer intense intervals with endurance athletes. And so I think kind of the practical recommendation that's out there right now is there's a time and a place in training for different types of work rest intervals. Perhaps when someone's trying to improve VO2 max, they want to do higher intensity on the intervals with larger rest breaks. Whereas if they're trying to improve lactate threshold, they want intense but lower intensity intervals for a much longer duration, because you want the muscles to experience what it is like to be at threshold when there's these protons and stuff hanging out causing damage for an extended period of time, and then taking very short breaks in between those intervals so that you can get just enough lactate and protons out of the muscle to do another one, but not much more than that. So I don't know. I've heard people. There's really not like a hard line, between a hard interval versus something someone might call HIIT. How long does the interval have to be, and how intense before someone says, that's not HIIT or that is HIIT? There's no clear boundaries there. But interval training, period, long, short, whatever, is here to stay. I mean, it's popular, it's effective. We just don't know in the long term if someone just did that and no base work, is that effective? There's no evidence to support that either way yet.
I don't know if it's common knowledge with my circle of athlete friends, but if you did a 12 or 15 minute HIIT workout, that can have greater benefits than doing an hour and 15 of straight cardio at a 70% effort. Is that true?
Yeah. I mean, from a variety of perspectives, a shorter, intense workout like you described could elicit some of the same aerobic and anaerobic benefits as a longer one. But the thought is still that there are probably some unique adaptations from each that may not be well teased out or documented yet. I'd say traditionally, for instance, the base building work that athletes will do in the off season, lots of miles, low intensity. Traditionally, it has been shown that will help increase mitochondrial density within the cells, the muscle cells. So more mitochondria means higher VO2 max. Typically, you'll see an increase in capillary density, so the blood supply to the muscle increases, and that's like trying to widen I-90. Right now, it's 3-4 lanes, and you say, okay, we know we're going to get more traffic later in the year, so let's make this 8 lanes wide. We're not going to need it yet, but we will later. Adding more blood vessels just gives us more of an infrastructure for harder work down the road. So we know those kinds of adaptations take time to develop, and low intensity, sustained work does a good job of developing those. So the thought traditionally has been that's why you do the base, develop this infrastructure, and then the intervals allow you to use that infrastructure. Well, some of this new stuff, particularly the high intensity interval cycling with disease populations, they've looked at things like mitochondrial growth, blood capillary density, and they're seeing some of the same benefits from that type of training that have traditionally been just associated with the sustained low intensity work. So again, maybe the high intensity stuff is exactly the same benefit as the low intensity stuff, just it's quicker. Maybe there's something more unique to that the low intensity can't provide, and vice versa. That is still being teased out a little bit.
So HIIT is here to stay.
Without a doubt, it's got a place. It's just a matter of how much.
In our fast-paced life, doing a HIIT workout how many times a week could be as beneficial as I got to get my 3 runs in, my 3 bike rides in, my 4 swims in.
Mm-hmm.
You still do some of those things, but if you're limited on time, how many of those can we not get away with, but can we use and say, okay, this is almost a substitute in the meantime?
Yeah, I think it's highly individual based on someone's ability, based on their lifestyle, how much stress is going on. Because one thing that we know with high intensity work is that you're going to increase catabolic hormone levels. Catabolic hormones are things that break things down. So one that's really common that you'll hear used a lot is cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. So typically after some sort of a high intensity workout, you need a decent recovery, and that's where low intensity work can help aid that recovery time. But how long you need before the next one is going to be subject to how hard was it, how ready for it were you, how stressed out were you before you went into it, how much training history. I mean, there's a lot of things that can affect that. So to be able to say, 3 is you shouldn't do more than that, or you should only, it's really hard. It's up to the individual. I think that's where things like heart rate recovery and all these new apps that they have for phones can be so beneficial to aid that recovery process and to inform, is it time for me to do another high intensity workout? Because if you're still kind of in the dumps from the last one, doing another one is not going to be helpful. Yeah. But maybe if the toss-up is, gosh, I think I need to do an hour-long easy ride, but I don't have time for an hour. I'm going to do this 15-minute really intense thing. But you don't know if you're recovered from the 15-minute intense thing. We'll do 15, 20 minutes of easy stuff, because that's going to help you recover faster. Doing something is better than nothing. It's just a matter of, should it be light or easy today?
So if someone's has a coach that puts them through a workout program and they go, where's my off days? Where's my rest day? Well, that swim day was your rest day. Yeah. It was a low intensity, just getting in the yardage or the meters. That's your off day, because we're not really taxing the body so much. Or maybe that after that long ride over the weekend, your Monday or Tuesday bike ride is an hour easy. Is that the same kind of philosophy?
Yeah, and I think especially on those rest days, it's really important for a coach and athlete to understand what is restful. So to communicate very clearly, the purpose of these workouts is to facilitate recovery. So this isn't a pride workout. You're not going to try to beat any records. You're not going to try to beat someone. You just need to go out there and take it easy. In fact, there's several famous runners who are all elite level marathoners, 10K run, those kinds of things that for their easy runs were no faster than 10 minutes per mile. Sometimes they joked that there was an old lady in a walker that was going faster than they're running, but they recognized that the purpose of that run was simply to just increase blood flow slightly, help facilitate recovery, and then of course when it's time for a track day, they would throw down, and they could because they're ready for it.
You've heard so many people say if one is good, 2 is better, of workouts in a certain intensity. Not always.
Not always.
Got to be mentally disciplined to follow the plan and trust the plan, right?
Really mentally disciplined, yeah, and there's a big trust piece.
Yeah.
Now, part of that trust, if it's someone that's self-coached, I think is going to be derived from good records, like you mentioned, logging things on Training Peak or something else, an app, Garmin Connect, whatever it is you're logging into. And if you're able to kind of look at those and say, okay, I've been here before, I know what's going on, I have felt bad before, but I know it's going to take 2 days to feel better. I think that develops kind of some self-trust. And then if you're working with a coach, good communication, and then of course experience with that coach, because there's never really a one-size-fits-all type of thing either. One coach might say, well, I've trained, this champion and this champion, so this is the program to do it. But if someone's not ready for it, it's probably more or less just going to destroy them. There's got to be an individualized piece to that.
Yeah. Dr. Silvers, I had so many topics. We may have to try to revisit this. I mean, we got over VO2, lactate, heart rate, hits. I had so many other topics, but we're running kind of long here. So let's wrap this up. Thank you so much, Dr. Matt Silvers, Assistant Professor here at Whitworth University, in the Department of Health Sciences. Is there a way that people can learn more about you or even contact you? Would you want that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Probably the easiest way is to either email me directly or to look up my information on the Whitworth website. So I'll give both. The Whitworth website is www.whitworth.edu. And if you were to go to that website, just type in my name, Matt Silvers, in the search bar, and it's going to come up to my faculty page and has the information. If people want to email me directly, it's msilvers@whitworth.edu.
Are you offering up your services? No, I mean, of course, it's paid services, but you even have.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a busy guy.
Yeah, I enjoy training.
Okay.
I enjoy being surrounded by athletes and the sport, and because there's such a practical component to it that if I don't keep myself immersed in that piece, it's really easy to get lost, I think, in the research and not necessarily knowing how that applies to people. And so I enjoy talking to people. Anyone's welcome to contact me if they have questions or whatever. And because I do coach on the side, if anyone is ever looking at something like that, that's something we can discuss.
It'd have to be, correspondence, obviously, for people outside the area.
Yeah.
And just so everyone knows, I probably said this before during your intro. What is some of your athletic accomplishments? I mean, you're
Sure.
a multiple Ironman finisher.
Correct. Yeah. I'd say finisher. I don't know. No champions there, but yeah. Primarily I was a runner to start with. I've been running for 20 something years now, and never didn't compete in college, but I just continued with the running thing, and then in graduate school I started to become more competitive, and so I've done several marathons, a couple ultra marathons. I've now completed 3 Ironmans, and I'm slated for a 4th this upcoming summer. And then any other challenges. Last year, I tried to do something completely new, and I trained myself to be a wrestler. Well, I shouldn't say I trained myself. I sought help.
Yeah.
One of my friends used to be an international competitor in wrestling, and so for the entire year, I just did something way out of my element, and it was great. It was, I think really restorative heading into the next Ironman because I had a big break from that mentality.
Yeah.
But I trained to be a wrestler, competed in a tournament last year, took 3rd, which was actually impressive, since I was going against college kids.
Yeah.
I was only the 3rd person in the division, but I still took 3rd, and it was fun.
You signed up.
Yeah.
Half the battle is actually doing the race,
And
doing the
stepping
event,
into
right?
it. You got it.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it, and we'd love to have you back. And we'll see what the response is on this. And if they have more questions, we'll follow up.
Sounds great. Thank you.
And that will wrap it up for this episode of the Endurance Hour Podcast, episode 119. I hope you enjoyed that and took some notes. Re-listen to it if you have to. Roger and I will be back next week for episode 120. If you have some great topics that you want us to discuss, please send it our way to endurancehour@gmail.com or leave it for us on our Facebook page. Keyword is Endurance Hour. Until next time, I'm Dave Erickson. Have a great week of training or racing. We'll see you back here next time.